Some of you think the solution to fighting racism is more racism. Welcome to the Rob Lett Show. I'm your host, Rob Lett. The truth about affirmative action. That's the focus of today's podcast. We've got a lot to unpack here today. I've covered a lot of controversial topics, but if there was ever a topic that will probably get a lot of black people mad at me, it's this one. Some of what we're going to cover today is, what is affirmative action? What is it supposed to do? What does it actually do? And misconceptions about affirmative action. But before we get started, I'd like you to go ahead and do a few things. First of all, like this video, subscribe to it. If you're on YouTube, to the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a bell. That's a notifications bell. Click it and it'll notify you the next time we release a new show. If you're on Rumble, though, to the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a share button. Click it and it'll share this video with a friend of yours who should have been here with us today. Go ahead and do all of those things that apply right now. So what is affirmative action? Depending upon who you ask, you're bound to get a few different answers. If you ask people who are pro-affirmative action, they'll tell you affirmative action is a policy that gives everyone an equal opportunity in all matters, from education to jobs and more.
Those are your emotions acting without the benefit of intellect.
If you ask people who are against affirmative action, they'll tell you affirmative action is legalized discrimination disguised as giving someone an equal opportunity. And the latter is a more accurate description because at its core, affirmative action is a policy of preferential treatment. I already know what you're going to say, but Rob, there was already preferential treatment. That's why affirmative action was required in the first place, because people were showing preference over others. Technically, that's not fully accurate. You're correct in the sense that affirmative action originally rose out of people's prejudice, but you're incorrect in the sense that the preferential treatment people experienced back then was a preferential policy. Let me give you an example. If you were at work right now and one of your favorite cousins was seen entering into your building, I'm sure you would ask, hey, what are you doing here? If they told you they were applying for a job, I'm sure you'd ask who they've spoken to, what type of job they're applying for, and if you had any influence whatsoever, you'd even put in a good word for your cousin. That's preferential treatment because you'd prefer your company hires your cousin over someone else. But that's not a preferential policy because there's no government regulation mandating that your company hire your cousin. There's no regulation saying how many of your cousins have to be hired. There's no regulation requiring your cousin to work there for a certain period of time. Are you following me? Preferential treatment is how you feel. A preferential policy is the law. Affirmative action is a law requiring you to show preferential treatment to someone, or in this case, to some groups. One of the reasons some of us have a hard time believing affirmative action is a policy of preferential treatment is because, quite frankly, we don't get out of the country very much. We view most things from the perspective of the United States, and as a result, we tend to view most things in terms of black and white, when in reality, India has had affirmative action longer than any other nation. Since 1947, in fact. So there's a lot of data on whether or not affirmative action actually works the way we think it does. And none of the data involves black or white people. So it's impartial. In the US, we tend to think of affirmative action not as a preferential policy, but as a tool to help minorities level the playing field. But that's my point. If you leave the United States for a minute, you'll discover that affirmative action isn't always used to benefit minorities. Sometimes affirmative action is used to benefit the majority. In Malaysia, affirmative action was used to benefit the majority who felt at a disadvantage. How can that be, you ask? Well, as you might expect, in Malaysia, Malays are the majority. The Chinese are actually a minority, but they saved more, they worked harder, they even went to college, and before you knew it, they were a wealthy minority, not a phrase we're accustomed to hearing. The Chinese earned twice what the Malay majority earned, causing resentment among the Malays. In the local universities, the Chinese dominated. The more difficult the subject, like science and math, the more it would be dominated by the Chinese. In the decade of the 60s, the Chinese received 400 degrees in engineering. The Malays received 4. Colleges can only accept so many students, and since admission is by qualification, the Chinese were going to be admitted at higher rates. Have you ever heard of someone getting Malayed before? By 1969, there were riots of Malays against the Chinese. So the government stepped in to fix this disparity and to make it fair for the majority, the Malays. They even changed the language in the university from English to Malay, to put the Chinese at a disadvantage, of course. Keep in mind, the Chinese didn't cheat at anything. They weren't even the majority. They merely changed their cultural habits. All the things we're told we should do when we don't like our outcomes. And instead of being rewarded for their merit, the government stepped in to create a new reward system. Not one based on merit, because they tried that already. The government was creating a new reward system to show Malays' preference. There's no other way to say it. So without a doubt, affirmative action is a preferential policy, which is to say it is a preferential treatment law. So now it's time to ask, what is the reported purpose of affirmative action? According to Britannica, affirmative action is supposed to improve education, employment, and other opportunities by including members of groups who have been subject to discrimination and are underrepresented. Before making his pick for vice president, Joe Biden gave his simplified definition of affirmative action on MSNBC.
So it is important that my administration, I promise you, will look like America, both as from vice president to Supreme Court to cabinet positions to every major position in the White House. It's going to look like America. It's critically important that be the case. I can guarantee you that.
So you have Biden on one hand who says he believes his cabinet should look like America, and then you have the stated purpose of affirmative action on the other hand, which is to improve education, employment, and other opportunities for groups that have been underrepresented. You may ask, well, isn't that the same thing? The answer is no. They're not the same thing. Because the word improvement is a results-driven word. But what something looks like, well, that's just a matter of appearance. We'll come back to this later. This is the classic argument between conservatives and leftists anyway. Conservatives wonder what the actual results are of a policy, and leftists tend to be more concerned with how things sound or appear to the general public. Homelessness is a perfect example. Seeing someone on the street and giving them money because they're on the street is not an evil thing to do. No conservative ever said that. What we ask is, what will be the result of you giving someone money who lives on the street? The result is you'll see them on the street again tomorrow. Because if everyone keeps paying them, sooner or later that homeless person makes more money per hour than you do at your day job. So the appearance of giving money looks thoughtful, looks caring, but the results are horrible. If you disagree, all you need for proof is to watch my last video on the failed war on poverty. I broke down more than 50 years of the left fighting education and poverty, only to have the highest rates of homelessness in California and children who are incapable of grade level mathematics despite having a high per pupil expenditure. But we're not talking about the failure of the left's war on poverty today. Today we're asking what the results are of affirmative action meant to help a group of people. In the case of Malaysia, many of the Chinese moved out of Malaysia. They also pulled their capital out of the country because they were finding it harder to get into universities despite them being better qualified. In 2020, so this is fairly recent, Malaysia announced that they now plan to return to admissions by qualification because they were finding that they now lack the number of engineers and tech people required for them to have the type of economy that they desired. So the preferential policies the Malays thought would be helping them as a country were now hurting them. It only created more resentment to the point that their most talented people were now leaving the country. So they're discontinuing it. This is a great time to go back to the stated purpose of affirmative action, to improve education, employment, and other opportunities for groups of people. If affirmative action was an improvement, then why are they discontinuing it? I once heard Milton Friedman allude to the fact that apartheid in South Africa had its roots in affirmative action policies. I honestly hadn't had the chance to fully research that, but really there's no need, because I now understand how that's possible by understanding what happened in Sri Lanka.
As of the time that Sri Lanka became an independent nation at the on the late 40s,
Yes.
people inside and outside of Sri Lanka were holding it up to the world as an example of harmony between majorities and minorities and saying, we can learn from Sri Lanka because it's so peaceful that people get along together. There had, in the first half of the 20th century, there was not a single race riot between the Sinhalese and the Tamils. And there are many evidences of the amity between the two groups. No problem until they became an independent nation and until they began having elections. And one man, Solomon Bandaranaike, wanted to be prime minister, and so he pushed identity politics. And he pushed the idea that the Sinhalese ought to have all these preferences and quotas. And it's clear that it was only to get himself elected.
They were the majority after all.
That's right. And once he got elected, he lost interest in this stuff, and he's ready to work out some deal with the Tamils. But by this, he had worked people up so much with his identity stuff that now they turned on him and assassinated him. And since then, the subsequent leaders got the message clearly, and they began pushing extremism toward the Tamils. And eventually things got so bad because, you see, the Tamils really had a poor area, so education was their only real way up. Mm-hmm. And when they were shut out, not totally, but shut out to a great extent from the universities, they were desperate. And nothing would move the government, and eventually there was civil war. And in that civil war, this little country lost more people dead than the United States lost during the entire Vietnam War.
So let's recap. Some of the actual results of affirmative action have ended in everything from riots and the stagnation of a country's growth, as in Malaysia, to outright civil war and deaths in Sri Lanka. But we live in the United States, you might say. What do any of those outcomes have to do with us? They're exactly the same. Thomas Sowell said something that I actually hadn't given much thought to. He talked about how a lot of colleges and universities today are actually where a lot of racism is taught. And it kind of makes sense, especially when you think of all of the colleges and universities who are dying to teach your children CRT right now. I had to think back to my own days in college.
What's the state of prejudice in the United States today compared to, earlier years in your life?
It depends on the base year, like most comparisons. If you take 30 years ago, greater. Certainly greater in the academic world. In the book that I wrote about colleges, I urged minority parents not to think that because they had a good experience on a particular college campus 30 years ago, that their children will have that good an experience today, because the racial tension is enormous on many campuses. The colleges themselves try to say that they're victims of the racism of the larger society. And in point of fact, the racism on the campuses is greater than that in the larger society, in many campuses. And what I worry about is that they're going to graduate into the general society, blacks and whites alike, who hate each other's guts, and who can be the leaders of new racial strife for the future.
What's causing that on college campuses?
One of the factors is the preferential policies.
I went to an integrated college, and honestly, when I think back to the times that I felt the most separated race-wise, it never came from any of the students. We all got along fine. Most of the separation that I've ever felt actually came from the faculty. From the time I got my dorm room, the person in charge wanted to make sure I had a black roommate because I'm black. Keep in mind, I didn't mind either way, but they assumed I did. Later, all of the black students were corralled by the same person for a Black History Month presentation. I ended up in the local newspaper for a speech I gave at that time. And even though my speech was liked by both blacks and whites alike, I honestly don't recall the time where any of us got together and was having a discussion about race. We spent most of our time playing pool or watching TV together. Looking at the subtleties of my college experience back then and observing the way things are right now, I'd actually have to agree with Thomas Sowell that colleges and universities are actually fanning the flames of racial division for political purposes. Which takes us back to the question we opened with: what is affirmative action actually supposed to do? This is where things start to get fuzzy, because when we originally looked it up, it sounded like the intent was to improve things for the people who are underrepresented. But we learned from Malaysia that the phrase underrepresented is all relative, because they used affirmative action there to help the majority who was being outperformed by the minority. When Biden spoke, his version focused more on how his cabinet looks, which we've already established doesn't necessarily mean it's improved someone's life. That can be solely an appearance. So that's two beliefs about affirmative action already, but believe it or not, there's also a third. Thomas Sowell tells the story about working in government, and it became known that there was some additional monies available for minorities for some particular project, and that this additional money wouldn't impact his department's budget whatsoever. Sowell said, great. He knew this Jewish woman at Princeton who he'd love to bring on as an assistant, and he didn't have the money to pay her. When he mentioned this to his supervisors, they informed him that Jews were not a minority, especially not Jews from Princeton. Well, this is obviously incorrect. Jews were certainly a minority. What his supervisor was trying to convey to Sowell is that there's a third opinion about affirmative action, and that is, not all minorities are minorities. It all depends on whether we feel sorry for you. Jews have done well financially, so nobody felt sorry for Jews. This only goes to reinforce my original assertion that affirmative action is a preferential policy, because it can be twisted to mean whatever you want it to mean. To better understand some of the effects here at home, in 1987, of the 312 black students entering Berkeley, all were admitted under affirmative action. Like Joe Biden's comments, their enrollment closely reflected the ethnic distribution of California high schools nearby. What were the results? More than 70% of the black students failed to graduate. Understand something though, even though I'm obviously talking about race, the reason they failed had absolutely nothing to do with race. It had everything to do with performance. The average black student at Berkeley is above the national average in test scores. It's just that the average white student is further above the national average, and the average Asian student further above than that. So had these black students applied to a university they were qualified for, they would have done well, since they're above the national average in test scores. But affirmative action artificially turns these students into failures because they're mismatched with Berkeley. Do you understand what I'm saying? Let me give you a real life scenario that has absolutely nothing to do with affirmative action, and yet it does. Do you remember Kimbo Slice? Kimbo Slice was a street brawler who got his fame from YouTube. I remember when this guy was on the rise. His videos were going viral before we really even knew what viral was. Every time I saw a fight, he was either knocking somebody out or the guy he was fighting just totally gave up. Kimbo was just too much for them. Then something happened. Somebody hyped Kimbo up to start fighting professionally. Mixed martial arts was starting to gain in popularity, so he figured he'd give that a go. Here's a clip from one of his fights. I lied. That wasn't a clip from his fight. That was the entire fight. What went wrong? I thought this guy could fight, somebody said. Kimbo could fight. But understand the kind of people Kimbo were fighting were guys who worked at UPS who knew how to fight a little bit. It was the dude who worked at your local grocery store who knew how to fight a little bit. Kimbo was better than all the average people, but suddenly he's thrust into a different group of people. These guys at the MMA don't work at UPS. In fact, all they do for hours on end is practice how to kick a guy in the neck. They don't have a day job. That is their job, kicking people in the freaking neck. They've won belts for this. They've received championships with this. They've toured the world for kicking guys in the neck. Kimbo wasn't in Kansas anymore. He got mismatched. There's a big difference between fighting the average Joe and trading blows with the best fighters in the world. That's why 70% of the blacks at Berkeley failed. It's not because they're not smart. Heck, they're above the national average, but likewise, they were mismatched by affirmative action. These are some real-world casualties of affirmative action. When you rush to fill a slot based on some arbitrary characteristic like gender or color, many times you're going to find people who are mismatched for their job. Remember all those beliefs I covered about affirmative action earlier? Kamala is a perfect example of those beliefs in action and the train wreck results they can cause. They say hindsight is 20/20. So in hindsight, we should have known Biden was going to pick Kamala Harris as his running mate. I mean, he already let you know he believes his cabinet should look like America, which is something he just says for votes, by the way, and I'll prove it later. As his justification for appointing black women, he says black women are his biggest supporters. But let me remind you of this little exchange Biden and Kamala had when she was running for president herself.
We've also heard, and I'm going to now direct this at Vice President Biden, I do not believe you are a racist. And I agree with you when you commit yourself to the importance of finding common ground. But I also believe, and it's personal, and I was actually it was hurtful to hear you talk about the reputations of two United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country. And it was not only that, but you also worked with them to oppose busing. And, you know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
Remember that other belief that the candidates of affirmative action are sometimes the people the public feels sorry for? Well, don't forget, when Kamala made that statement, it was the talk of the night. So much so that a photo of Kamala as a little girl began making its way around the internet. They even made t-shirts with the phrase on it. So if you add in all of Biden's other beliefs about affirmative action, coupled with the fact that this particular black woman directly accused him of discriminating against her, we should have all known he'd pick Kamala Harris as his running mate. But the bigger question very few people ever seem to ask was she qualified to be the vice president? There were a lot of rumors I was hearing about Kamala Harris, and since I never followed her in the first place, I didn't know where any of those rumors were coming from. I won't repeat those rumors here because you've probably already heard them anyway. I didn't realize Kamala Harris used to date talk show host Montel Williams.
Long before she met Doug Emhoff, she dated some prominent men, including in 2001, former talk show host Montel Williams. Back then, he was the famous one and had to introduce her to the paparazzi.
Another reason I'm not harping on those rumors is because everybody has a past. And although a person's past is important, remember the point of this particular show is about the effects of affirmative action and whether affirmative action helps or hinders. If there was ever an affirmative action case where someone was mismatched for their job, Kamala Harris would be it. Almost instantly after Biden taking office, she was on the hot seat.
Talk to you about it. Let me just quickly put a button.
Okay.
Do you have any plans to visit the border?
I'm here in Guatemala today. At some point, we are going to the border. We've been to the border. So this whole thing about the border, we've been to the border. We've been to the border.
You haven't been to the border.
And I haven't been to Europe.
While the hot seat comes with the territory, it's her responses that people remember. She came off as being clueless and combative, a bad combination. And I'm not trying to nitpick with her. I'm just saying she genuinely seems like somebody who's in way over her head. Occasionally she'll give a speech on something that she thinks is profound, but it always backfires and further highlights just how unqualified she is.
One of the things that is not helping her is when she actually says things that people start scratching their head over. Here she is yesterday in Sunset, Louisiana, talking about the significance of the passage of time. See if you can follow this logic.
The governor and we were all doing a tour of the library here and talking about the significance of the passage of time, right? The significance of the passage of time. So when you think about it, there is great significance to the passage of time in terms of what we need to do to lay these wires, what we need to do to create these jobs. And there is such great significance to the passage of time when we think about a day in the life of our children.
Somebody should come up with a drinking game where every time she says passage of time, you take a shot. Right. I think there were 4 or 5 passages of time during that short passage of time.
There was that time she was asked to explain the Russia and Ukraine conflict on the radio. And she said this.
If you're watching any level of news, even social media, you're seeing everything that's going on right now in the Ukraine. Break it down in layman's terms for people who don't understand what's going on and how can this directly affect the people of the United States.
So Ukraine is a country in Europe. It exists next to another country called Russia. Russia is a bigger country. Russia is a powerful country. Russia decided to invade a smaller country called Ukraine. So basically, that's wrong.
As low as Joe Biden's approval ratings are right now, Harris has managed to poll even lower than he does. That's saying a lot considering the fact that the vice president is less visible than the president. But Biden is totally undeterred by this practice of picking candidates based on their color and gender. In fact, it's become his hallmark. Just this week, he replaced Press Secretary Jen Psaki with Karine Jean-Pierre. This time, Biden didn't stop at just appointing a black female. Jean-Pierre checks 3 boxes. She's black, she's a female, and she's LGBT, whatever letters they got after their name now. Again, are they the most qualified, or do these people serve as window dressing to appeal to different voting blocks? I'm really astonished at how everyone is so comfortable with Biden just saying he's picking a black woman and that's it. I wonder what would be the reaction if any president just got on camera and said, you know what, I just realized white people are the ones who support me the most, so I'm going to be appointing some really sharp white people. What would be the response from the media? But if a Democrat does it, it's okay. I know this is going to sound repetitive, but it's the mother of learning. So let's backtrack here. So the stated purpose of affirmative action, again, is to improve education, employment, etc. So let me ask you, if 312 black students are encouraged to apply to college, they don't meet the requirements, but they're further encouraged to take on a student loan for a curriculum that everyone knows they'll probably flunk out of. Do you consider that an improvement of their situation? Or are they now saddled with debt because affirmative action set them up to fail?
Look, at MIT, the average black student is at the top 10% nationwide in mathematics, and in the bottom 10% at MIT. And 1/4 of them don't make it. Now, when you realize how few black students at that level, to lose 1/4 of them, you can't afford that. I think there's another larger loss that you have. You have the kid who goes to a top-level school, and he wants to be a chemist or whatever, and now he gets there and he finds he cannot learn chemistry as it's taught at that school. Does not mean he can't learn chemistry. It means that they have very high-pressure students. They can teach this stuff at a very fast rate, skipping on explanations, skipping over steps in the mathematics, And these students will all pick that up as they go along. He may find that he can't keep up with that. And so in order to survive, he switches into some easy subject, which may be some ethnic studies program or what have you. And so someone who could have gotten a first-rate education at a good college ends up getting a third-rate education at a top college, or ends up flunking out altogether.
If 312 black students came from a predominantly black school where they were doing well academically and now they're flunking out, do you think they believe they're suddenly less intelligent, or do you think they've developed some views about the white staff at Berkeley? If you said the latter, do you think that's an improvement?
Put yourself in the position of a black kid who comes out of a ghetto school, and he's gone through for 12 years with nothing but A's and B's without a great deal of effort. And now he finds himself for the first time in his life in a predominantly white environment. And he finds that when he works twice as hard as he's ever worked, all he gets back for his work is a D. And that there is also a minority establishment. This is true not only of blacks, but of minorities in general. Establishment which tells him, yes, this is the racism on this campus. That the white power structure is trying to keep you down. And it has to have a certain plausibility to it. It would have had a certain plausibility to me had I come along in that era. Now, I was fortunate enough in one sense that having grown up in the South and then transferred to New York, I was shifted between different levels of education. And so I was a top student in my class in North Carolina. And then I was immediately the bottom student in my class in Harlem. And I was way behind whoever was next to the bottom because the educational differences were just that great. Very painful period of adjustment, but there was no racial issue involved since all the other kids who were ahead of me were all black, and so I got through that. But it's truly criminal what goes on in terms of using and manipulating the students to serve all kinds of external purposes. That you have students there who are tremendously alienated because they suddenly find themselves in this situation where academically it's all they can do to keep their noses above the water, if they can do that. And then there's someone there to tell them that this is all due to the white power structure. And then there are the white students who are sick of hearing that. And they say, if you can't hack it, that's your problem. Don't give us this junk. And then that's called insensitivity. It's self-reinforcing. There are some reactions that are self-equilibrating, but there's some that keep feeding each other. Let's say an ugly racial incident happens on campus at one of the elite colleges. Invariably, the first thing that will be said is we must have now a larger quota of minority students, a larger quota of minority faculty, and we must now subject the white students to these sensitivity courses or ethnic courses or what have you, courses that they've rejected taking, otherwise they wouldn't be necessary to force them. That is not going to make things better. That's going to make them worse.
For the white or Asian students who actually had to pass the entrance exam, do you think they're fine with people who don't have to meet the same criteria? Or do you think this breeds feelings of favoritism toward those 312 students? Would you consider this racial tension as an improvement in race relations on campus? Let's switch gears here for a minute, because so far we've only been talking about education. But remember, affirmative action is supposed to improve employment and other opportunities. Let's talk about those other opportunities. Do you remember back in 2008, one of the reasons for the real estate crash?
All right. I quote you again. Some of the least knowledgeable and least experienced home buyers were now financing their purchases with some of the newest and most complicated mortgages.
Yes, because the whole notion was that you wanted to make housing affordable to people who otherwise couldn't buy, which meant low-income people, often people of limited education, people who had never bought a house before. And so they were presented with these complicated mortgages that often began with very low initial rates. So you'll pay $500 a month for this house, but in 6 more months you'll be paying $800, and then at the end of the year you'll be paying $1,200, and 2 years later you'll be paying $1,500. Well, not everybody may have understood all that.
Do you consider it an improvement to give someone a mortgage that they didn't qualify for? To have the bank take their house back from them? To have a foreclosure on your credit for years? And their family uprooted in the process? Do you consider that an improvement? You know the answer to every one of these questions is not only no, but hell no. Affirmative action is sold as an improvement in all of these areas, and yet these are the facts. The results of preferential policies globally. So who's benefiting from affirmative action then? Is it the university? Is it the faculty? Is it the Democrat Party?
There's another group, I guess, that benefits from this. You have an establishment there, a Black Studies establishment, who needs students to be in their classrooms. And these students serve those purposes. People who have political movements have people they can mobilize for those movements while those students are there. It's very much like what happens in athletics, that you have students who come in, as long as they can score touchdowns, the coach is happy. The fact that these students don't graduate is not the coach's problem. His problem is how to hold on to his six-figure salary and his job. And the students have to be sacrificed, and they are sacrificed.
But you say, now come on, Rob, so no minority benefits? Surely you're not about to say that, are you? No, I wasn't. What might surprise you, though, is who among the minorities are benefited. The way affirmative action is sold is as a tool for leveling the playing field. Those with the least advantage are now given an opportunity. However, that's not true. For a second, put yourself in the position of a human resources manager. You have to hire a minority, and there are 2 black applicants. One of them has 2 college degrees and a fairly extensive work history. One of them hasn't gone to college, and they've got very minimal work history, if any at all. The reality that nobody ever likes to discuss is, what are the things that can happen if this applicant doesn't work out? If the applicant with very minimal education doesn't work out, there's a very strong chance he might file a lawsuit with the EEOC, he might bring in Al Sharpton, the NAACP, or some very expensive, publicly embarrassing alternative. If the applicant with the higher education doesn't work out, since he was already educated, the odds are great that he'd probably just find another job and never cross his mind to file a lawsuit. So what just happened? What just happened is the law that you think benefits some poor kid from the hood most likely doesn't benefit them. Instead, it's more likely to benefit someone like a Colin Powell or a Condoleezza Rice. In other words, affirmative action tends to help minorities who are well off to start with be better off. But just for a second, I want to take it out of the realm of black and white here at home. I try to do that by explaining affirmative action globally. Too many times with these conversations, the focus is on blacks and whites in the United States. If you haven't figured this out by now, I just want to be clear that the race, gender, nationality, sexuality, religion, no matter who you insert, affirmative action has been a failure every place it's been tried. Here's me proving it again. So let's shift gears. I think I proved my point that affirmative action isn't just a black and white issue like we think of in the United States. It's a global failure. But to drive home that point, let me talk about the lawsuit that Asians filed against Harvard. An organization called Students for Fair Admissions filed a lawsuit against Harvard University. These aren't my opinions, mind you. These are facts. No recent court cases propelled Asian Americans into the political sphere like Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, and no issue has galvanized them like affirmative action. The plaintiffs allege that Harvard discriminates against Asian applicants by holding them to higher academic standards and rating them poorly on personal characteristics such as likability, fit, and courage in order to suppress their rate of admission. Invoking Harvard's past practice of using subjective measures like character to limit the number of Jewish students in the 1920s. The Students for Fair Admissions, SFFA, allege that the university is now repeating its ugly history with Asians, charging Harvard of imposing a racial penalty and a de facto quota on Asians. SFFA's proposed solution is to retreat from race, to eliminate the consideration of race and ethnicity in all admission decisions, which in turn would effectively eliminate affirmative action. I know someone out there is going to watch this and say, but Rob, what in the world would happen if we didn't have affirmative action? Wouldn't that mean we'd never have opportunities, never have jobs, never get into college? No, actually, that's not true at all.
Even where affirmative action programs have been in place for decades, almost nobody ever examines the actual results.
That's right.
How come?
There's no political payoff for looking at the facts. And what do you get? You're a politician. What do you gain by looking at the facts? You don't know what the facts are going to turn out to be. Are you going to bet your career on how the facts are going to turn out? Right now, for example, since they've eliminated affirmative action at the University of California system, I have been trying to get data on what about the graduation rate of black students now. At least one region of the university is trying to get that data.
The UC system eliminated affirmative action, what was that, about 4 years ago, Tom?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, fine, go ahead.
And so
in other words, there's time for results to have come in.
That's right. And people like myself have been saying for years that if you allow blacks to redistribute themselves within the system, each one going to the university for which he's normally qualified, you're going to have a higher graduation rate. And graduation is what it's about. It's not about being on campus so the administration can gush about diversity. It's so these guys can get an education and go out in the world and get the advantage of that. That data is not available. Nobody can pry it loose. The same thing is true in the University of Texas system. I mean, imagine
These are public institutions.
That's right. But imagine you're head of the University of Texas. You don't need data coming out saying, my God, now that you got rid of affirmative action, black graduation rates have shot up. Because then you've been saying all along that this is a wonderful thing for blacks. You got too much invested to take that kind of risk.
Now, why do you suppose Berkeley won't release the new graduation rates after the removal of affirmative action? Are they scared we'd learn something about preferential policies? We've covered a lot of misconceptions about affirmative action in this show, but the one that we haven't covered yet is the fact that those who oppose affirmative action must somehow be opposed to equal opportunity. And that's not true at all. Equal opportunity means achieving things based on merit, and nobody's opposed to that. At least not conservatives. Well, we'll never get it all, but we sure unpacked a lot. In this episode, we uncovered what is affirmative action. We said affirmative action is a law requiring you to show preferential treatment to a group or groups of people. What is it supposed to do? According to its stated purpose, we learned that it's supposed to improve education, employment, and other opportunities by including groups of people who've been subject to discrimination and underrepresented. What does it actually do? However, we learned that affirmative action actually does none of those things it just claimed. At least not for the masses of groups it claims to help. In fact, affirmative action has failed everywhere it's been tried. It's led to blacks flunking out of and being saddled with debt for colleges that they shouldn't have been admitted to. It's led to Asians filing lawsuits against universities for trying to keep them from enrolling. It's led to racial tensions on college campuses for all races of people. So that's definitely not an improvement in the area of education. It's led to racial tensions on the job, with other groups feeling like someone took the spot of someone who is more qualified. And it's actually put minorities further behind than if affirmative action had never existed in the first place. When it comes to other opportunities, affirmative action has led to more foreclosures and ruined credit than if affirmative action had never existed in the first place. And all these are just the beginnings of its failures. As we pointed out, affirmative action has led to riots in Malaysia, people fleeing the country over it, and outright civil war and deaths in Sri Lanka, far from the improvement claim we read on Britannica. Misconceptions about affirmative action. Really, this entire show was about misconceptions of affirmative action if you think about it, because most people's conception of affirmative action is that it's great when it's failed everywhere it's been tried. If you argue that it's been a success, then you have to explain why 250,000 people have either been killed or disappeared while trying to implement it in Sri Lanka. You'd have to explain why the Chinese left their own homeland in Malaysia if it was so great, and why Malaysia later discontinued the practice. You'd have to explain why the University of California at Berkeley discontinued the practice of affirmative action and refuses to release any graduation data for comparison. What university do you know wouldn't release information about their college if it were positive?
Don't worry, I'll wait.
Exactly. They know the data is horrible. Yeah, you'd have a lot to explain. So the only misconception left is that those of us who are opposed to affirmative action must be against equal opportunity somehow. And we already said that's not true. That's just a cop-out for not wanting to do the work. Listen, I just explained to you that the Chinese in Malaysia used to be poor minorities. You don't think they had the same feelings as other minorities? The same experiences? Of course they did. At some point they'd had enough, and they changed from a poor minority to a wealthy minority. They changed from an uneducated minority to an educated minority. They succeeded so drastically that the government changed the rules on them. And that, my friend, is all you need to know about government. Make sure you stick around for our next podcast, Why You've Never Heard Me Call Them Liberals. Because some of you forget, words have meaning. I'll conclude with the words of Thomas Sowell. Affirmative action in the United States has made blacks who have largely lifted themselves out of poverty look like people who owe their rise to affirmative action and other government programs. I'm Rob Lett, and I approve this message.